special invited guests from the past in another journey through time. Our focus tonight is on historical human quest for understanding nature and interacting with nature. Now, I think most of you in the audience today probably agree that there's an international, perhaps a national consensus that our species, our human species, must lighten its footprint on the Earth if indeed civilization is going to survive and the planet itself is going to survive. But most of our guests this evening lived at a time before that consensus was arrived at. And they are still back in time when the excitement of expanding scientific and geographic frontiers still set the prevailing tone. So for a majority of our guests, the future for the human race knows no bounds. And although two of our guests appear to have a little bit of enlightenment, they're very optimistic characters, but President Theodore Roosevelt and John Wesley Powell both recognized at their time that resources are not boundless. And that it's important to retain democratic, that's small d, Democrat, control over the management of those resources. John Wesley Powell was quite aware of the arid West was going to be short on water, and of course President Roosevelt was very far-sighted in his concern for public forests and public land. So throughout your program tonight, you will notice what a difference a century makes. Faith in science, as the ruling principle, is now considerably diminished. I think I'm a little sad to be saying that. I think it's true. We today view the role of the human species through a different lens than did our 19th century thinking guests. And we today are increasingly aware of the diminishing size of the globe and its finite limits. Well, our time together tonight is very definitely limited. We've been given 90 minutes from now, so it's a 90-minute rule. We'll ask each guest to introduce himself or herself and introduce themselves to you within 6 or 7 minutes. And after 6 or 7 minutes, I will definitely talk at their coats to ask them to sit down, because we want to make sure that there is plenty of time at the end, that we have at least 30 minutes for the final analysis by our very special guest and for the questions from you. All of our panelists tonight, except for our special guest, Dr. Clay Jenkinson, have day jobs at North Idaho College. They are transformed for the evening, as you can clearly tell, into historical figures of their own choosing. I think that's important for you to know, that they have chosen their characters. Each of our guests is in one way or another a visionary, and certainly each is an independent thinker. I'm going to list their introductions in the routine that they're going to take. The first one will be Henry David Thoreau, who is portrayed by Alan Lamb. Mr. Thoreau needs little introduction. He was the original American nature boy with an attitude. He lived from 1817 to 1862, and through his writings, he turned Walden Pond into an American legend. He was a writer, a dreamer, a rebel, who rebelled against the intrusion of government and regulations into our daily life, and that sounds familiar, doesn't it? He was definitely an individual and a transcendentalist. Our second guest will be Michael Faraday, and he will be portrayed by Dr. Ken Wright. Mr. Faraday is the prominent chemist. I'm sure you all know about Michael Faraday, a prominent chemist and physicist from Great Britain, who paved the way for the widespread use of electricity today. Well, we give Ben Franklin credit for identifying or discovering electricity, with the kite and all. We really can see each other tonight and hear each other tonight through the mic because of Michael Faraday. He was born in 1791 and lived until 1867. And as he will tell you, he had to work hard to become a successful scientist. Reputedly, he was a man who never spoke unkind words about anyone else, and he was very religious. After that, we will hear from Edwin Hubble, who accepted the invitation of Kurt Nelson to be with us tonight. Mr. Hubble was born in 1889 and died in 1953, and Mr. Hubble We're familiar with your name because of the Hubble telescope, but we're eager to learn more about what you did to change the course of astronomy in our country. And we understand you developed the theory of the expanding universe, and your years were 1889 to 1953. After that, we will have as our guest Theodore Roosevelt, our 26th president. He's a familiar figure to all of us and rated by historians as one of our greatest national leaders. We are most familiar with President Roosevelt's political career, you know, the Bull Moose Party and all that, but we don't want to offend John Wesley Powell, who doesn't care for politicians. They gave him a very bad time. So Jason Luker, as Theodore Roosevelt, will portray the president's contributions to conservation and his lifetime interaction with nature. Theodore Roosevelt lived a remarkable life between the years of 1858 and 1919. And then we will see and hear from Rachel Carson, who is a very quiet and scholarly woman whose book, Silent Spring, was published in 1962 and at that time shook the very foundation of the powerful chemical industry and led to changes in laws and the uses of pesticides, notably DDT, which she showed to be damaging the reproduction of birds. She is here at the invitation of Andrea Carter and Lori Olson, and Andrea will portray her character. Rachel Carson was born in 1907 and died of cancer at the age of 57. And finally, we will have as our guest a real character, Harvey Manning, who calls himself a modern minimalist. He is brought to us tonight by Scott Peterson. Would you wave, please, Harvey? He's the author of a book, Backpacking One Step at a Time, and he said, "I'm not trying to be nice or make friends, I'm trying to save wilderness." Describes his occupation as mountain bum. And then finally, after that, we will hear from John Wesley Powell, portrayed by Dr. Clay Jenkinson, who will discuss some of the ideas and practices from his position as an explorer, a geologist, a technocrat, a bureaucrat, and a controversial figure of post-Civil War time. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, let me bring forth our first guest, Henry David Thoreau. The mic is yours.
Well, is this thing on? Well, I didn't expect to be nearly 180 years old and back on the Lyceum circuit, which in modern day talk would be the lecture circuit. I also was kind of, surprised because I ended up here in my clothing, which I was doing some gardening in, so I'm a little less formally dressed than I might be typically on the Lyceum circuit. However, I also noticed that I'm in a bit stockier body than I was then as well. So, but that might be a plus because I tended to the thin side when I was, back in the 1800s. I don't know how to begin because typically people responded to me in sort of a mixed fashion when I went out and talked about what I believed in and what I did. Sometimes people really responded well and sometimes they did not respond well. I somewhat had a little bit of notoriety. Some people thought of me as a recluse, a hermit, somebody who was antisocial, and somebody who essentially did not get along with people and wanted to be by himself out in the woods. In a way, there's some truth to this, but in a way, there's also a lack of truth to this as well. I notice looking in modern journals and books and whatnot that people have accredited me with being the father of conservation and preservation, although I would say my spiritual friend John Muir was probably more accurately such. But I also noticed that ecological journals and ecological books list me as being one of the founding fathers of ecological attitude or ecological thought. That I would probably claim I really, really did have in my heart. What's really interesting to me is that I've had an impact in another sense as well. I advocated standing up against the government, particularly when the government tended to do what I consider to be unjust things, like slavery. I was against slavery. I was an abolitionist. And also when the government used money that I would pay, for example, on things that I did not support, such as the Mexican War and, again, slavery laws. But what really impressed me was that there are some very famous men in your history that came after me that seem to have been impacted by my methods and what I advocated in terms of standing up against the government. Some of these people include Gandhi, Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy. And I advocated essentially civil disobedience with nonviolence, passive methods. And apparently this is one of the things that's had one of the more far-reaching impacts in today's society. I never really intended that to be the case, though I'm really happy to see that it had that impact. Now, I suppose most of you are here wanting to hear about Walden, which is considered to be my most famous work. But I have to tell you that Walden was actually secondary to what my real intent at Walden Pond happened to be. Again, this goes back to what people thought about me. They thought I was going to Walden to be a hermit and to be out of society, to be a recluse, and just they weren't even sure what I was going to do. Many people really had it actually wrong, my original intent for going to Walden. My intent was to go to Walden, collect my thoughts, and to write a book in tribute of my older brother. And most people don't understand or don't realize that my older brother and I had a very close relationship. My older brother being John Thoreau Jr., named after my father. He was 2 years older than me, and he had a tremendous impact on my life, as did my parents. My parents had a tremendous love for nature. They didn't get along very well, but they tended to agree on one thing, and that was nature and enjoying the beauty of nature and taking us out on picnics and things like that. Well, my brother tended to gather these type of thoughts as well, and he became a fairly good bird watcher, I guess ornithologist in the technical parlance. And this rubbed off on me, and I read a lot of his books, and I took his enthusiasm with me. Well, my brother died when he was quite young in terms of he had a lot of life to live. He was 26 when he died, and he died from something that was really quite insignificant. He died January 11th, 1842, and he died in my arms, and this was the saddest moment in my life. What happened was January 1st, 1842, he cut his finger, just the tip of his finger with a razor, and he wrapped it up, but he did not clean the wound. And because he did not clean the wound, it soon got infected, and he died of lockjaw. And this was a very sad occurrence in my life. And Walden Pond, living at Walden Pond, was actually an attempt to collect my thoughts and to start thinking about writing a book that was a tribute to my brother. And this book, which came out a bit later, was called A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. That was my first book, and that was my tribute to my brother. Inadvertently, however, Walden Pond brought another book forth that was to be my most famous work, called Walden, or On Walden Pond. This particular work really, I guess, was the lifeblood of what convinced people to look at nature differently, to look at nature as something to be enjoyed, something that transgresses themselves, something that's greater than the whole. And this particular work took many years, actually, and refinements before I actually put it out. Walden Pond, I started living there July 4th, 1845. Some people thought that was kind of significant because it was Independence Day, and they thought, well, this is his independence from society. Well, actually, that it was Independence Day was sort of an accident. The real reason was my brother's birthday was July 5th, and I spent my first day on Walden Pond enjoying the anniversary of my brother's birthday. Well, this book, Walden, was really, really seminal. It really does not reflect my whole stay at Walden Pond. I was there for 2 years, 2 months, 2 days. The book itself really reflects my journal notes from the first year of staying there. My first year, people came up and asked me all sorts of questions. They asked me why I was doing this, what I was learning, and this book was actually a response to all these questions. One of the things that indicated very strongly that I was not a hermit and I was not really being a recluse or anything like that is the fact that while I was at Walden Pond, I would go back into Concord, I would have meals with family and friends, and on occasion, family or friends would come out and visit me. In fact, in my little cabin, which was 10 feet wide by about 15 feet long, I had 3 chairs, one for solitude, one for friendship, and 3 for society. And that was part and parcel of the way I was trying to live. Let me finish with one little quote that I wrote in the book Walden. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. Thank you.
David is obviously not a hermit. He loves people, but we must hear now from Michael Faraday.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to see so many of you here. This definitely reminds me of my recent years lecturing at the Royal Institution, which is in London. I must tell you that I have recently retired from lecturing at the Royal Institution. I'm afraid that the years have definitely blurred things. The memory has become dim, as I'm sure you'll soon notice. Let me tell you that I was born plain Michael Faraday on September 22nd, 1791, in Newington Butts. And before you laugh too long about that, let me tell you that in Great Britain, Butts is an area that was used for firing practice. And actually, Newington Butts was once an archery range. At the time I was born to a blacksmith father and a country-maid mother, why, Newington Butts was sort of a suburb of London, but by now it has been totally enveloped by the growth of London, and you can't recognize it now at all. My family were Sandemanians, belonged to a religious sect, very small religious sect, and we Sandemanians believe in the Sermon on the Mount, and therefore we worship differently, and we have been made fun of. At our gatherings on the Sabbath, why, we wash each other's feet, and we hold services. Our ministers are not paid. And when I was a child, I had a good deal of fun made of me by the other students in the school, and plus the fact that I could not say the letter R properly. When I said rat, why, it came out wat, and not right, but white. And so my fellow classmates made a lot of fun of me. And my teacher, who I only had to put up with for 1 year, because that's about all the formal schooling I had, actually was going to thrash me because I simply wouldn't say the letter R correctly. And my mother did not feel that a thrashing was what I deserved for that, so she summarily removed me from the school, and that was essentially the end of my formal education. So I really grew up on the streets of London. At the age of 12, well, we were dirt poor, let me tell you that. And my mother used to give me a loaf of bread, which had to last me the week. I definitely learned to divide things out and parcel things out that way. Because we were so poor, I was apprenticed at the age of 12 to a bookbinder. And this actually turned out to be probably a stroke of great luck, because not only was I had about as much time to read the books, because Mr. Ribot, a nice Frenchman, gave me the opportunity to read the books as well as to work on binding them. So I indeed took a fancy to science, and particularly to things electrical and chemical, and I read everything I could get my hands on. And so I sort of learned things on my own. But by the time I was 19, it looked pretty grim, because it looked like my apprenticeship was over and I was going to have to go out and get some sort of a job to earn whatever meager living we could put together to help the family out. Well, a great fortune befell me, because one of the customers of the bookbinder, a Mr. Dance, offered me some tickets to a series of lectures at the Royal Institution by Humphrey Davy, the great Sir Humphrey Davy. And while the lecture series was going to cost only a shilling, that was actually a large sum of money to us, but my older brother Robert, who I used to call Wobbert, was able to come up with the money, and so I was able to attend the series of lectures, and I loved it. And I took great notes. I took detailed notes. And eventually, while I was looking for a job, I was having considerable difficulty, I applied to the Royal Institution, which is the foremost research institution in London, and didn't even receive a reply at first. But finally I had a chance to show my notes to the great Sir Humphrey Davy, and he was quite impressed. and so ultimately hired me as his assistant. Actually, I was little more than a janitor and kind of gopher, as you would say now. Anyway, this was a great opportunity, and then a second great fortune befell me, because shortly after I started at the Royal Institution, Sir Humphrey Davy was going to tour Europe, and I got to go along. And the tour lasted for almost a year and a half, so from 1812 until into 1814, while we were touring Europe. And I got a chance to go to France, where I got to meet Ampere, for whom the unit, the Ampere, is named, and Germany, where I met some of the leading scientists, and eventually to Italy. And in Italy, I got to meet with Alessandro Volta, for whom the Volt is named, and his compatriot Luigi Galvani, for whom the galvanometer, which I hope to demonstrate to you shortly, was named. Anyway, this was a great opportunity. The only really downside of this opportunity was that Lady Humphrey did not really like me very well. And while I don't like to say unkind things about anybody, she really took great pride in trying to mortify me. And I would have to say that she was a difficult woman. Anyway, upon our return to London, I then had a chance to assist Sir Humphrey, and we had some very interesting discoveries, and I learned a lot, and soon I was getting to make my own experiments. And over the course of time, I got to dabble in a lot of things. I got to do a great many experiments. And because my mind has dimmed, I'm afraid I'm going to have to refer to some notes here to tell you the exact dates of some of my discoveries. In 1821, I worked on what we now call electromagnetic rotation. And this means that a wire which is carrying a current can be shown to rotate when it's placed into a magnetic field. Now, we were able to produce electric currents because Volta had developed the battery. And so we could make a source of a steady electric current, just static electricity. In 1823, I was successful in working with Sir Humphrey Davy in liquefying chlorine, which may not seem like a particularly outstanding thing to you, but liquid chlorine was quite a new thing, and we also went on to liquefy some other gases. And then I isolated benzene in 1825, and finally in 1831, probably my greatest discovery was electromagnetic induction, and this is the production of an electric current by moving wires in a magnetic field, or moving a magnetic field through some wires. And finally, in 1833, two laws of electrochemistry, which have been named after me, the Faraday's laws of electrochemistry. And ultimately, a unit has been named in my honor, the Faraday, which we now call a mole of electrons, and an electrical unit called the Farad, which measures the amount of charge that you can get. And some of the new terms that we had to come up with to describe these phenomena you've probably heard of, so I'll just mention them quickly. An ion, a cation, which is a positively charged ion, and an anion, which is a negatively charged ion, and an electrode. And we had cathodes and we had anodes, and we still call them that. And finally, diamagnets and paramagnets and ferromagnets. And the word dielectric are all words that I developed with the help of William Whewell, which was a friend of mine at Trinity College at Oxford. Anyway, probably my greatest contribution, I guess the world seems to think at this point, was the idea of field. And so the lines, what we call lines of force, and fields associated with electric currents, with magnetism, and even with light, are now described by what we call field effects. And it's my belief that each type of force could be converted into others. So it was possible that we showed that electric current had magnetism associated with it, and then I was able to show that you could produce electricity by moving wires in a magnetic field. And that resulted in what you now know as the dynamo and the electric motor. So it turns out that others went on to actually develop the dynamo, and I have it here, or a small model of one, and if there's time, why, I will be glad to demonstrate it for you.
Thank you.
Okay?
Thank you very much. We welcome our guest, Edwin Hubble.
Good evening. It's nice to see all of you here this evening at the Observatory Conference Room. Maybe I should take this pipe out. I know a lot of you are up here to late evening, and quite a few of you are interested in why I'm even working here at Mount Wilson. Mount Wilson Observatory, the 100-inch telescope. Some of you probably are wondering why they call me Major. It could be you don't even understand the work I'm doing. But let me tell you a few things about maybe how I got to be here. I actually went to high school in Missouri and moved to Chicago and finished up, and then I always loved astronomy. In fact, this refractor telescope over here is a model of actually the first one that I looked at, and I just fell in love with astronomy. But my old man, my dad, had different ideas for my future. He thought I should study very hard, study the classics, and he had aspirations for me to be a lawyer. Now, the problem with that personally was that I at that time, being around Chicago, got wind of this Rhodes Scholarship deal. So I studied really hard the classics, mythology, and Roman stories, Homer, etc., because I knew that was a very high point system for the Rhodes Scholarship. Also, I had to be a well-rounded athlete, so I turned out in high school to as many things as I could. I never actually got a blue ribbon in track and all these things. I was always 2 or 3. I was always a C. I was so athletic and I was fairly tall, and I had a good time, and I worked hard and got about a B average, but in the event, I did get to go to Rhodes as a Rhodes Scholar to Oxford, and was selected to go to Queen's College. Queen's College, of course, had a long history, and when you went there, you met other people from the United States. And I always had in the back of my mind that my old man, my dad, said, mind yourself, don't drink, keep your religion, be nice to people, and major in law. So in Oxford in those days, you kind of picked a major, read a few books, and you studied for exams, and in 3 to 6 months, you had a degree eventually. So I finished up in Oxford, in England, and got a little bit of an accent and loved the clothes that they wore, and I played on the teams, and I rowed the shells or boats, and I ended up with a degree in law and also one in literature, but it was literature-Spanish. So I came home, and then I took a job as a high school teacher, and I taught Spanish, of course, and physics and math, coached basketball, team won really well. They told me that I talked above everyone's heads, but they ignored it anyway, because that's a good sport about things. What I did is I actually yearned to be an astronomer. So I applied for graduate school at the University of Chicago, and I was accepted and quit the job in high school teaching and went to school in astronomy. At that time, Yerkes Observatory was there, and they had a 40-inch telescope I could look through, and I looked really late at night. I had to dress warm, but that was okay, and I studied faint nebulae. That was my ambition, to look at pictures and photograph those pictures and look in the plates and memorize those plates. It was easy for me to memorize a whole plate, take a picture, and next month take the same picture, and then compare which dot was different than the other one. It was no problem for me, and that was an aptitude that I had. So I finished a PhD in math and astronomy. World War I happened really fast, and I felt obliged to join up, so I joined up, and in 1 month I was an officer. My doctoral thesis had to be finished, and of course I don't quite remember what happened, but it was 16 pages long, and my major prof wrote to me after the war and said, "Did you really have a good copy of that, typewritten copy?" So I had to reproduce a real good typewritten copy, because I just handed him one when I left for the service. Went to England and France. I had 600 men under me. It was kind of tough the first winter in the United States, wintering over with these 600 people, because it was cold. And I thought I'd be a real man and be a real officer and not wear a hat. And my ears became a little bit frostbitten, so I had to put a hat on finally. After the First World War, I went back and actually did research, my real love in astronomy. I got an opportunity to work at Mount Wilson, a 100-inch telescope, took pictures of faint nebula. There was a great debate in 1920, Curtis Shapley debate. A lot of you probably don't even remember that debate.
You're right.
The great debate was the shape of the galaxy that we live in. Did the Earth live on the edge? Were we on the edge of this great galaxy, the Milky Way? Or were we at the center of the Milky Way, the sun at the center of the Milky Way, everything going around? 1920, this was a big flurry. It was called a debate. I started looking at distances to stars, and gratefully for Henrietta Leavitt, an astronomer lady, she came up with the period luminosity graph. And I took the period luminosity graph and looked at Andromeda M31, and by golly, there's some Cepheid variables up there. And the Cepheid variables, then I could relate the distance to the Andromeda galaxy. No one believed us that it was 33,000 light years away. You see, in the 1920s and the early 1930s, no one knew the real physical size of the universe. These numbers astounded everyone, and then as we looked at the line spectra from those stars in the galaxies, we had found that there's a Doppler shift. And we call it a red shift because it shifts towards the red end of the spectrum. And when you calculate the math like I did, and my assistant, Humison, who was actually a mule train driver up to the mountain, who we trained to take pictures at night, and he got really quite famous for this, enjoyed it, and spent hours developing these photo plates. These plates took about 2 hours. You had to train the telescope on a point in space, keep it for 2 hours, and develop that to get these nice pictures. It was a pretty good scene. I lived in Pasadena, but when you go up to the mountain, you're kind of alone, and it's kind of lonely up there, and you sit and play cards, and you look at telescopes, take pictures, and you become great friends. I really amazed everybody one night because they were going to serve me a midnight rats, which is you couldn't have coffee up there because Hale wouldn't allow it. So we had to have cocoa and crackers and sandwiches. And I washed my own dishes, which I did in the Army anyway. And this took a lot of people aback because they figured that they had to wait on me because they called me Major. That was my nickname. But I became pretty good friends with those on the hill. Took pictures, and we had the redshift of tens of hundreds of kilometers per second that these galaxies that I was finding were going away from us. Slipher did this earlier in about 1910, but no one believed him. So the great debate was on. We still don't know the size and the shape of our Milky Way, and we have some funny feeling that everything's going away from us. And in my honor, they named a constant called Hubble's constant after me for that. It's kind of interesting. World War II broke out, and I felt obliged to serve again. I joined up. Of course, they gave me a job at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, or the grounds where you have projectiles and ballistics. I didn't even know what the word ballistic meant. After the Second World War, I returned to my real love, research of galaxies. Came up with a galactic classification code. I was even offered presidency of Caltech, but I turned it down and I refused because I really wanted to do research. I had friends, Einstein, Charlie Chaplin. These are real people. They get together on weekends and play violins and play pianos and sing, and I like to do that. I don't play any instruments, but I like to listen. So I've had a good number of friends, and I have a gracious wife named Grace who took notes all of her life, and her journals probably will be read someday about my character, as odd as I have been. So I welcome all of you this evening to the observatory. I hope it isn't too cold outside, and I hope you enjoy the sights when we look at some of our galaxies.
Now, Mr. President, are you ready?
Yes, well, thank you. Normally, myself being Teddy Roosevelt would not need a microphone. I'd be pretty loud, but I'll tone it down a little bit for you. I just got back from a trip down to Africa, and as you notice, I've probably slimmed down a little bit from that trip down to Africa. I'm still kind of trying to lose a little bit more. It wasn't like that when I was a kid, unfortunately. When I was younger, I was stricken with asthma. I was born in 1858, and my father sat me down one day and said, "Son, you have a serious problem. You have asthma. You're going to need to do something about that." You need to seize the day. You need to seize the moment. Life is just but a small little pinprick on the earth, and you need to do something about it. You need to make yourself a man. You need to get out there and work out. So what my father had me do was he would throw me into water, make me swim. He would make me do all these different chores and different things. But of course, I was very loyal to my father and participated in these chores and loved them and loved him for it, for he made me strong. Because when I was younger, again, I was asthma, and I was asthma stricken, and I had a hard time getting along. When I was in Africa, I killed 512 animals. 17 lions, 11 elephants, 20 rhinos, 9 giraffes, 47 gazelles, 8 hippos, 29 zebras, and 9 hyenas. Wonderful. It was such a good trip. I loved it. The reason I got all these specimens is because the scientists, our scientists need these animals to be able to study them, because it's during a time when we didn't have that much information about some of these wild animals over in the Amazons. And of course I did it for food, and some of these also went into my trophy room in my house in New York. I was born in Oyster Bay, New York, and there I lived and continued my life until my death, which I did die of asthma, believe it or not. And again, my father did believe in the balanced man, meaning balanced man, he meant physically, he also meant intellectually, and also spiritually. He taught me the values of being what we call an American. During my presidency, what to me was an American were all the people, whether it be African or Jewish or Irish or Italian. All these people that were colonizing the West were Americans. We were all one group. In fact, during my time, women were still looked down upon. Women were still the people that were supposed to stay at home, fend for the kids. Believe it or not, during my college years at Harvard, I wrote a paper on the equality of sexes. I couldn't tell anybody about that during that time because at the time it would not have been a very good political move on my part, but I was completely into the equality of sexes, even though it was not happening at the time. My love for the nature all started way back when I was a kid again, as a child, and my father would again take me on hikes where he made me the strong man I am today, and he actually taught me this little game, and we called it point to point. And I loved to take my guests who would come down to the White House, and I'd have to entertain them. So I'd take them on hikes out on my 90 acres that I lived at down in New York. What we would do is we'd have this hike called point to point. One evening I took 2 British officers that were neatly dressed in nice white uniforms, and of course I was dressed in my normal, usual outdoor attire, and we went ahead and played this game point to point. Well, what point to point is when you go from point A to point B and you get there any way you can without going around anything. Well, each day I would do this little adventure, whether it be with the British officers or whether it be with my 6 kids. I would, with the British officers, we were actually coming back to the White House, and of course going from point A to point B, there was a pond in front of us. And of course, being the person I am, being very strong, being the type of person where I'm going to go from point A to point B no matter how hard it is to get there, I took those British officers through the middle of the pond with their white uniforms. And unfortunately, during that time, we were spraying the ponds with oil to keep the mosquitoes from getting in the ponds. And of course, these British officers came back. And to me, it was just, again, another day, A to B, and these British officers followed me right through that pond and went home with dirty uniforms. But we all had a great time. I was a very, very adventurous person through my years. And to cover all that I did during my presidency in terms of for the nation and also for nature and the conservation of our natural environment, it'd be kind of hard to cover it all in 6 minutes. It all started when I went down to the Badlands. I've been hunting there for years, but one year I went back and I found that I could not find any big animals to kill one year. When previous years I was actually able to go down there and kill 2 mule deer with one shot. Now I go back there, there's no animals. So what can I do about this? What I did before my presidency is I joined I made a club or started a club called the Boone and Crockett Club after some people that I'm lost of words. Yeah, but I read about or my. Thank you, sir. I started the Boone and Crockett Club, which I was actually the president of. Earlier in 1872, Congress had made Yellowstone a national park, but they had not made any type of laws concerning the control of building of resorts and cutting of timber. So my Boone and Crockett Club then in 1984 came up with the Park Protection Act, which then stopped the building of resorts and the cutting of timber and the killing of animals just so the people could come and have a safe place to stay. I also helped make a lot of laws that helped national forests during my presidency. And that goes back to my father again. My father believed that you could not cut down, he did not want to cut down any trees unless they were diseased.
Mr. President, you've got to move on.
Excellent. Again, I mean, that's a lot of years and there's a lot going on. Thank you.
Well, Rachel Carson, are you ready?
Good evening. My name is Rachel Carson. Some people refer to me as the first American ecologist, although I certainly wouldn't take on that overwhelming title. I was a writer and a biologist. I wrote about 4 books on the sea and sea life and the power of the sea. And then I wrote a book called Silent Spring, for which I'm most famous for. I was born in 1907 in the Allegheny Valley in Pennsylvania, and I was kept from school by my mother. She was terrified that I would contract influenza, which was a terrible epidemic at the time. And also, the farm where we lived was quite in a remote area, so travel wasn't very easy. But I managed to do well in school when I was there. My classroom became the surrounding area of the farm, the forests and the fields there. I was also in love with writing, so I would go out to the fields and into the forest and write poems and stories and essays. And when I was 10 years old, I won an essay contest, and I continued to enter contests. I went to the Pennsylvania College for Women, and like every good girl in America, I was an English major. And but in the middle of my undergraduate career, I took a zoology class, and that really, well, I guess you would say it turned me on to science, and I wanted to study biology. So I went to the president of the college, and I said, I want to change my major to biology. And the president, of course, was shocked. Women didn't go into the sciences. But I remember a quote from one of my favorite poets, Tennyson, who said, "Go forward." So I went forward, and I graduated with honors in biology. And then I went to Johns Hopkins University, where I studied zoology and biology. And I wanted to go on to get a PhD, but my father died in 1935, and so I had to assume the role of breadwinner. So I had to be the sole provider for my family, and that meant I had to get a job. So I went to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and worked for them, and gradually I became chief of publications there. So I got to write and work with nature, although I wasn't out in the field where I wanted to be. At the Wildlife Service, I wrote my books about the sea. I had always been interested in or concerned about issues of conservation and chemical spraying, which I became more and more concerned about its use in the environment. And the last two books that I wrote, The Sea Around Us and The Edge of the Sea, were very popular books. A lot of people read them, bought them, and therefore I had enough financial independence to not work for the government, not quit my job. And I decided, even though I had written articles about my concern for these chemical sprays, I couldn't get anybody to publish me. So I decided if news articles and magazine articles weren't going to make it, I might as well write a book. So that's what I decided to do. So I quit my job at the Wildlife Service, and I started to work on Silent Spring in 1958. What I wanted to do with Silent Spring was to make the public aware of chemical sprays. These were pesticides, insecticides, and herbicides. Because we needed to do good things, and we needed to get rid of disease and pestilence and things like crabgrass in the backyard. Unfortunately, we were using very, very poisonous chemicals. Basically, some of them were even just watered down gases, poisonous gases that were used in World War I. Two ideas that I wanted to make clear to the public, and if I could run a film clip here just to show you what kinds of crop dusting, etc. Two ideas that I wanted to present to the public were time and balance of elements, or interdependence. These are not new ideas. I wanted to let the public know that certain compounds that we have engineered in there you have it, that's progress. We wanted to make sure that people could, the chemical companies wanted people to know that these things were safe, and they would spray DDT and tell people to come out in 5 minutes. Of course, I noticed that DDT was causing birds to fall literally dead from the sky, so there was something wrong with this chemical. Again, back to time, we didn't know if the world's been evolving millions of years, and if we let out, if we input chemical compounds into the atmosphere that we don't know what they're, how they will be released time-wise, we can be in real trouble. Some chemicals can decompose and then recombine with other chemicals and be 5 or 10 times as poisonous as the original chemical we've engineered. The other thing I wanted the public to know about was this interdependence of elements. If we remove one life form from the ecological community, that community will break down, and some or all of the plant life and wildlife will die out. We wanted to do good things. We wanted to get rid of malaria, which in epidemic proportions could kill whole villages of people. But if we removed the carrier of the malaria, which would be the mosquito, we run the risk of removing the food source to the fish who feed off the larvae of the mosquito, etc. So I wanted to make those ideas clear to the public, because the public would be the ones to bear the brunt of the danger and the adverse effects of the release of these chemicals into the atmosphere. I never said that we should not use chemicals, only in reasonable doses, but I also proposed other ways to control pests and insects. In closing, I'd like to say that although some people think that myself and the book Silent Spring are somehow responsible for the environmental movement. Yes, in fact, I testified before Congress that as a guest of President Kennedy to talk about the overuse and abuse of chemical sprays. There was a commission appointed during the Kennedy administration which found that the chemicals, in fact, were dangerous and toxic and were not safe. And so legislation was passed to protect the environment and human beings. I died in 1964, and shortly thereafter, in 1970, Earth Day, the first Earth Day took place, and also the Environmental Protection Agency was established, again, to protect human beings, wildlife, and the environment from the adverse effects of chemicals. Again, in closing, I'd just like to say that I was not a leader, I was not a spearhead, I was not a champion. I was merely an instrument through which things happened. Thank you.
And now we have Harvey Manning, mountain bum.
I suppose, first of all, I would like to say if there's one thing that might distinguish me above the rest of the panel is the fact that I'm actually not dead yet. So, but my name is Harvey Manning. I currently live in Issaquah, Washington, which for those of you that don't know is near Seattle. I guess I'm most famous for a work that I wrote in the 70s called Backpacking One Step at a Time, which has now become known as a backpacking Bible. However, any reference to the Christian religion, I guess I would have to pass on, and it wasn't me that called it a Bible. However, it is a how-to guide that will let beginners, intermediates, and experts hone their skills on the great art of backpacking. I guess reluctantly I've become a conservationist and kind of an activist for the movement to save lands, most notably in the North Cascades region. I guess it was a time back in the early or mid-1960s that I was approaching a place called White Rock Lake, and there was a beautiful heathered meadow upon the hillside there that we walked upon, and it was just a gorgeous day. And as I peered down into the horizon, I noticed down near the Seattle River this huge brown blight, and I thought to myself, my God, look at that clear cut. If we don't stop them now, they'll take this whole place. And so it was that time that I kind of quit becoming a hiker and a packer and kind of become a conservationist. A lot of people have criticized me for my work in Backpacking One Step at a Time for the fact that they think that it might be some irony in the fact that being a conservationist and creating a how-to guide has caused more and more people to maybe to utilize the trail systems throughout the state of Washington. But I always answer to those folks, what would you rather have, 100 pair of boots on the trails or one chainsaw? And so with that in mind, that's kind of how I like to answer and kind of how I proceed and to do what I do. The book Backpacking One Step at a Time I was asked to actually write it by a friend of mine, a gentleman named Jim Whitaker, who was actually the first American to climb Everest. And at the time, Jim was the president of the REI company in Seattle, and he'd asked me to do this book for him, so I kind of reluctantly proceeded. And it's currently in its 13th edition, I understand. And now being not dead, I'd also maybe like to plug it, because I still can receive some of the benefits of that book itself. And by the way, I'll plug Jim's company also is available at the REI company in Spokane, Washington. I guess as far as I've been labeled kind of a curmudgeon, and a lot of people think that I might be kind of outspoken. And currently, I guess the thing that I hate the most are people on mountain bikes. And I guess it's kind of odd that you might say that, but I absolutely hate being chased off the trail. I'm a 71-year-old man, for Christ's sake, by a bunch of young idiots dressed in their sister's underwear, yipping and yelling, coming down a trail. And I truly believe, since the topic of this discussion was how man interacts with nature, and we've heard from a lot of very famous people, some that like to observe it, some that like to study it and maybe manipulate it, others that want to save it, some that like to shoot it. And in a minute we'll hear from someone who would like to dam it all. But I would like to say that in my perspective, what I prefer to do is just to simply walk through it. And that's how like I said, I've kind of become a reluctant activist, because I really started out just with the love of the land and being able to walk through it. And part of the book, Backpacking One Step at a Time, I guess is what I'm most noted for, is the chapter, I guess they say that I'm the one that's invented low-impact camping, which is the basic premise. To me it was common sense, and it wasn't a big thing to come up with, but that when you go into an area, whether it be backpacking or whatnot, that you actually leave that area in the exact same condition that it was when you left it. So I know it kind of raises a stir for those folks that want to go into the backcountry to maybe for a romantic evening, that really a campfire is not part of the wilderness experience, because when you leave, you're leaving behind a bunch of charred rocks. And I hate when I come upon something like that to have to notice that somebody else has already been there. To me, that ruins my wilderness experience. You also might be surprised to hear that it really bothers me the fact that some people enjoy wearing Gore-Tex clothing with bright orange colors and bright yellow colors, and they think it's quite trendy. Well, in my opinion, that you're just once again taking away from my wilderness experience. If I have to look at you from across a canyon or whatnot, and that you stick out rather than the beautiful meadow, all I see is yourself. And so that was kind of the premise also of the book, was not necessarily to make more people go out into the wilderness, because I truly believe that my book didn't put any extra boots on the trail, but what it did was make those boots that were already going out on the trail become a little bit more aware of their environment and what they should be doing and how to take care of it once they were there. One of my slogans, I guess, when people ask me, how should we enjoy the wilderness? And it's kind of really been neat for me, because being a 71-year-old, my motto now is to go slower. And I usually wear a t-shirt, although I finally decided to wash it, but the motto on it simply says, make your world larger by moving slower. And so with that in mind, I would like to close and we'll let the next speakers go, but I hope with that you'll think on that a moment.
Well, good evening. Let me quickly respond to what I have heard. I'd much rather turn to you in the audience and hear your questions for any or for all of us, but let me say a few words. First of all, my themes are science and justice. I've been delighted to hear tonight from a zoologist, a student of electricity, an astronomer. I created in my time in Washington a club called the Cosmos Club, which was the precursor of the National Geographic Society, and indeed it included someone who's going to be here this week, Henry Adams, the great grandson of the President John Adams. And we met from time to time and had discussions much like this, in which each one of us spoke briefly about his field or his reading, and it was one of the most satisfying events of my time in Washington. So I enjoyed listening to the comments of people whose work I knew of slightly, but not particularly. We must listen to science. If we do not listen to science, we cannot save ourselves in the long run. We can trust science. We need a lively debate amongst scientists, and scientists don't always agree. But we must learn to trust science, and the politicians must learn to listen humbly and not to veto science merely because it doesn't serve their interest or the interest of their constituents. And I must say, although I didn't know the work of Mr. Roosevelt, except for all of that slaughter, I admire it. Because he listened to the scientists. He listened to Mr. Pinchot and set aside acreage for national forests, because science must always be the oracle of a free people. But my second issue is justice. Think of a square mile or a township. That's Mr. Jefferson's rectilinear survey grid that he imposed in one moment of grand enlightenment in 1784 from his desk at Monticello. And he placed, unprecedented in human history, that rectilinear rationalistic matrix across an entire continent. And every acre in Idaho has been parceled out by Mr. Jefferson's rectilinear survey grid. It's beautiful, it's orderly, and it's profoundly mistaken. Why? Let's say we have a township, and I own Section 26, and the only stream in this desert township is in Section 26, none in any of the other 35 sections. According to Mr. Jefferson's rectilinear survey grid, if I buy that section, I control the township. And if you buy any of the other square miles, it does you no good whatsoever, because I control the water. You can see that Mr. Jefferson's system might work in Virginia or Ohio. It cannot work beyond the 100th meridian because it creates conditions of inequality of access to the one vital resource of this region. So here's how it should work. With all of the respect we have for Mr. Jefferson, we should take his general ideas of an American agrarian utopia, but cheerfully discard his specific rectilinear survey grid in the West. And we should replace it with what might be called the long lot system, in which every farmstead or ranchstead would be guaranteed a certain number of acres that fronted upon the water source. That means they would be elongated like balloons, narrow at the river and rather wider as they got away from the river. But every citizen, every family would have access to whatever water was available. And as government, we would step in to classify the West before we parceled it out, and we would never sell any acre anywhere in the West without water inherent as a right on that acreage. Had you followed this advice, you could have saved yourself a history of nightmares in the West. But you didn't. You permitted inertia and the greed of men like William Stewart to prevent good sense and science from teaching you how to inhabit an arid land. And that's my point. Let me just read from something I wrote in my book about the arid lands. The problem with irrigation is that once you have diverted the streams for the easy irrigations, for the garden plots and for the hay flats, that's done almost immediately on every stream. It's done by private families. Once that's over, all of the subsequent irrigation projects require massive intervention. They require engineering. If you study history, Egypt, Iraq, other riparian and irrigation societies, they all end in desperate despotism and deserts. We cannot let that happen here. So we must find some way to break the cycle of monopoly and government gigantism that has made irrigation possible in the rest of the world. And here's what I said in my book about the diversions that would be necessary to make this western desert bloom. I said 1,000 millions of money must be used. Who shall furnish it? Great and many industries are to be established. Who shall control them? Millions of men are to labor. Who shall employ them? This nation is great. Its government is powerful. Shall it engage in this work? No. So dreamers may dream, and so ambition may dictate. But in the name of the men who labor, I demand that the laborers shall employ themselves, that the enterprise shall be controlled by the men who have the genius to organize and whose homes are in the lands to be developed, and that the money the money for these projects shall be furnished by the people themselves. And I say to the government, hands off. Furnish the people with institutions of justice, and let them do the work of reclaiming the West for themselves. If you don't accept that simple solution, it's either corporate monopoly on the one hand or gigantic government on the other. And we know in our hearts that we want neither. in a free society. Now let me make just several very quick responses to what I heard. I went down the Colorado in America, and yet almost immediately I designated 213 potential dam sites to reclaim the West, and 2 of them would be in the lower Colorado canyons, one where your Glen Canyon Dam is today and one where your Hoover Dam is today. So I enjoyed this pristine, never-to-be-repeated experience, and then I helped to flood those very valleys, making it impossible in your time. The West is filled with such paradoxes. Mr. Manning wants to go out and be alone in the wilderness, but he would rather you didn't. And of Thoreau, I can only say this: I admire his work enormously. I don't particularly prize a hermit, but I am reminded of the poor sales of his book Walden. He finally had talked a publisher into printing Walden, and he had about 1,000 copies printed, and the publisher sold about 115. And the publisher from time to time wrote to Mr. Thoreau and said, "This book will not sell." The publisher wanted Thoreau to buy it back, but he wouldn't. So eventually, in frustration, the publisher brought all of the remaining books and put them on Mr. Thoreau's porch in Concord. And Thoreau graciously later said, "I find that I have a library of over 1,000 volumes, 900 of which I wrote myself." Let me close by repeating one passage from my published account of 1875. And you might just close your eyes and think of yourself 3/4 of a mile in the depths of the earth. Because I do believe that even if we agree to share the West, it's useful to all of us to spend some time in sublime places, to recover our spirit, to renew our essential natures, and to realize what a bountiful continent we have in our midst. This is what I said one day, about halfway through the expedition. This morning, we climb the cliff on the left and find its altitude above camp to be 2,086 feet. On a rock, we find a pool of clear, cold water caught from yesterday evening's storm. After a good drink, we walk out to the very verge of the cliff and look down on the water below. I can do this now, but it has taken several years of mountain climbing to calm my nerves so that I can sit with my feet dangling over a precipice and look down 2,000 feet to the floor. But I cannot look on and see another do the same. I must either bid him come away or turn my head. The march of humanity cannot be stopped. And so I urge each one of you in this room tonight, at the end of your century and the end of your millennium, to go out as quickly as you can into whatever wild area still exists in Idaho or its surrounding area and enjoy it. Because humanity will not, in the end, leave it alone. I promise you that. Thank you.
Thank you, one and all of the panel members. At this time, I think we should invite you to ask your questions. I think we could probably ask Mr. Roosevelt to defend his slaughter, or to Mr. Thoreau to talk to us about the marketing of his books. But perhaps they can incorporate their responses in some of their answers, because I think we would like to hear the questions that you may have, the comments. So please, who would like to ask the first question? I think that it's been all over the map. Would anyone now like to come forth? Raise your hand with a question. To the scientist, to John Wesley Powell, or to the mountain bum? Fine. Nils, and then the person behind you. Please speak up. Yeah.
Mr. Powell, Lake Powell, which is named after you, has more miles of shoreline than the entire coast, Pacific coast of the United States. This is, by Lake Powell being created, this has opened up all these miles to adventurers or people seeking the solitude you talked about. When I was there this summer, we anchored our boat, and our little anchor line went over one rock. The next morning, 8 hours later, our rope had worn a groove an inch thick into this rock in 8 hours. So I'm just concerned with what your dams have created. Can you comment on that?
Well, there are several points there. First of all, the dam I had in mind for Glen Canyon would have been about 100 feet high. That's 600 feet lower than the one that was eventually put there. So keep in mind, when I say 213 dams in the American West, I'm talking about engineering of the late 19th century, not the gigantic engineering of your century, which indeed, I'm told, has required big government to make possible. That's one thing. Yes, of course, Lake Powell, named after me, in some regards is appropriately named because I both was the first white man to be in that canyon and one who advocated eventual dams for it. But I must say this, if you make the trip in your time from the head of Lake Powell to its foot, you will find no rapids whatsoever.
There was a question right behind Nils. Yes. The question for the tape is that Wallace Stegner wrote a book about John Wesley Powell, and is that an accurate account of your life?
Yes, it's a very accurate account of my life. I think he spends a little bit too much time talking about the boosters of the late 19th century. For example, William Gilpin, the bombastic governor of Colorado, who actually argued that if you plow up the West, rain will mystically follow the plow. But that sets the scene for science in that time of American history. There are two great books about my life, both of which I have mined very heavily in trying to remember it.
Another question, please. Well, while you're thinking of your questions, I have a question that just relates to the whole aspect of democratic involvement. And you have said today that you really wanted these cooperatives to develop, but you certainly were aware of the anti-democratic march of the expansion of agriculture. What really made you believe that this would be a different time here in the West and in the United States with the development of the Jefferson ideal?
Well, here's the answer to this question. It's not a satisfactory answer, but there have been moments in American history when we've had a chance to do things right. One of them was in Mr. Jefferson's time, when the entire continent is what he called a tabula rasa. And he tried very hard to create conditions of enlightenment in the American West, particularly with his bill for the government of the Western territories. But men like Jefferson couldn't anticipate the Industrial Revolution. They couldn't anticipate the aridity of the West. Mr. Jefferson was under some naivete about the West when Lewis came back with his accounts of the aridity and the treelessness of the prairies. Mr. Jefferson's response in a private letter was to say, apparently, it's so fertile on those plains the trees can't grow. Well, this is not good biology. I believe if Mr. Jefferson had been lifted in a hot air balloon of the kind being experimented with in his time and dropped into Utah, he would have changed his plans. He was a flexible man, but he didn't see Utah. He didn't see Idaho. He didn't even truly believe all that Meriwether Lewis brought back by way of data from the West. So, in a sense, an opportunity was lost because of Mr. Jefferson's beautiful naivete. Well, then when we came after the Civil War in a zany, restless energy towards the West, it was still largely uninhabited by white men, at least beyond the 100th meridian. Most of it was still to be deeded out. And so we had a second opportunity in American history to find laws and institutions which would make sure that justice and fairness were the center of that process. And this came coincidentally at the moment when science was finally being taken seriously as a national business. Government was finally beginning to let science be a part of its official budget. And so you have a great coincidence. The Civil War is a kind of demarcation point in American history. The West is still largely uncharted, undeeded, and science is now in the ascendancy in the 19th century. That's a golden opportunity to create conditions of equity and restraint that would never come again. And you ducked it. And because you ducked it, you allowed prior appropriation, you allowed monopoly, you allowed gigantism, and it has produced what I said in 1893 at the Second International Irrigation Conference in Los Angeles. My last words were, gentlemen, you are heaping up a legacy of conflict and litigation. There is not a fraction of the amount of water in the American West to enable the projects that you so grandiosely are outlining. And so the first order of enlightenment is to know your limits by way of science, and the second is, in a democratic culture, where the people are at least theoretically the sovereign, is to create rules of equity so that the few don't control the many and the many don't languish under a feudal system. So it was quite possible that you ducked it. Is certainly no fault of those few who were trying to argue for a scientific approach to nature.
Yes.
I would love to hear some examples of science being ignored in favor of political correctness in your era, and also what you see happening today.
The question is, he would like to see some examples of science being ignored and in favor of political correctness, and any examples that reflected you in your day. Any one of the panel, there are mics around, would you like to pick it up?
A couple of examples for expediency were the wars. And when World War II broke out, the television, the American television, was pretty well on its way and developed. However, we couldn't use it. We had to take our war effort, which was the development of the radar system that England and the United States played with. Myself, Edwin Hubble, was called to duty to study ballistics and projectiles of the war effort in terms of bombs, etc., to get the highest speed movie cameras to take their trajectory pictures. And so I was pulled away from the true advancement of science in terms of astronomy. So there's two examples. One is the telescope, the 200-inch Hale telescope, had to wait until 1946 to be restarted again. And also the American television set didn't show up until about 1947 or 1948, which is after the Second World War. So there's two political movements called war that stifle science.
Any other member of the panel? Mr. President, did you want to respond to that? Were you actually an instigator of political correctness that would have not used science?
Well, yes, actually, my whole theme was imperialism. I wanted to conquer the world. I wanted to. It all started with the Spanish-American War, when I decided to go into Cuba and conquer the Spanish and the Filipino people. Well, I decided to stay there and to pass on the American way onto these so-called lesser people and show them the right way, which I felt was the American way. And believe it or not, after 1 year of conquering the Spanish down in Cuba, the Cubans turned around 1 week later and revolted against us because we were trying to so-called Americanize them.
Very good. Rachel, did you have any response to that in particular? That you've already said that what you came up against.
Well, I just wanted to say that I wasn't the only one talking about the use of chemical sprays. In fact, there were several people before me who were worried about the effects of chemical sprays. So I was probably just the luck of writing at the time that I was writing. having the book published because there were other people before me who were upset about this issue.
That was a very good question. Anybody else have a question back there? Yes, back.
Mine's for Mr. Hubble. I'd like to know, at the time, well, before your death, what was known about the planet Mars in comparison to what is known today?
Would you repeat that question?
The question was, what is the latest on Mars? Schiaparelli thought there were canals on Mars. Percival Lowell, who worked in Arizona at Flagstaff, at his observatory on Mars Hill, thought there were canals on Mars. He had an assistant who really didn't agree with that. Those photographs were taken early during the latter part of the last century. And I died about 1953, and all we knew about Mars up to that time was that Mars didn't have canals, but had evidence of some canale, which is a river flowing of some type. Also, we knew that there were north and south poles that were waning and waxing due to seasonal changes. Our best photographs of Mars then were kind of cloudy. We knew that Mars had a fairly rough surface, possibly from reflection studies, had pole caps, and that was about it. As far as little green men on Mars, that was due to fictional writings in 1939 by Orson Welles. And the little opportunities that there might have been life on Mars was actually late 1870s by an astronomer who looked through a telescope. He didn't imagine things, but his eyesight was not as good, and you need really clear, good eyesight to look through telescopes hours on end. You have to stand in the cold, your eyes can't blur, you have to look at it and then draw physically the picture that you saw. Transfer it from your mind to a piece of paper. And when the atmosphere goes over, as the problem that I've had in the telescope, whether it's a Hale telescope or whether it's a 200H or 100H, there's always the atmosphere going across, and it blurs your vision, so you have to sit there, integrate in your eye and in your memory that picture and recopy it manually. With the new photographic techniques of new cameras, the Schmidt-Cassegrain camera that was mounted on Hale during my tenure there, that has opened up a wide view of new nebula and new galaxies, and it's very interesting to find out that we have taken pictures with the Schmidt telescope, and they're always indicating more galaxies. This is up through about 1950.
Let's have just one quick question, and then we're going to hear from Dr. Clay Jenkinson as himself. I believe you were the one over there.
I've got a question for Mr. Manning. Your house in Issaquah, is it built from lumber? And the furniture that's in your house, is it made from wood? And do you use toilet paper at least on an occasional basis?
Will you repeat the question, please?
The question is, what is my house built of in Issaquah, Washington? And yes, currently is actually a wood slat cabin. Actually, the neighbors don't really care for me because it's kind of in a quite affluent neighborhood, and it's not that I don't mow my lawn, it's that I don't have one. And actually, I think they also disapprove of the moss that's growing on my roof, which in fact some ferns have taken root and actually are growing on my roof. I'm not advocating that that these type of things not be used, for instance, lumber and whatnot. I'm just advocating that we don't run roughshod, and maybe we aren't using, or we aren't looking at America's resources in the best light. I think that's what where your question was heading, is how do we expect, I suppose, to get these things or to be able to wipe our butts without being able to cut the occasional tree. And so yes, I do agree that there is some sort of a balance that has to be made, but what I would say is that I'm uncompromising in my beliefs because I have to, and if you know anything, I guess, about means and medians and things like that in math, is that somebody has to be on that far edge to make the middle kind of back down this way. And so I guess that's where some of my beliefs originate.
Thank you. Well, I think you will all agree with me that Dr. Clay Jenkinson does an amazing job of staying within his character. Those of you who have seen him as Thomas Jefferson before and may again, and now have seen him be John Wesley Powell, he is true in every way to the character he understands as John Wesley Powell. But I think there is some frustration in that, and so now we've asked him to perhaps not take off his beard, but at least give a little analysis, a little finale for us tonight, of review in his person as Dr. Clay Jenkinson. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you. Well, I am going to take this beard off because it's very disagreeable. Yeah, please. You may disrobe in any way you feel the desire to. I just want to say a few words. I think it's just about time to close. But first of all, I just think the Chautauquans here deserve a round of applause for what they have done. It reminds me, I know several of you said you were nervous. It reminds me of when I first started doing Thomas Jefferson, and I was lucky enough to be asked to come to a National Endowment for the Humanities conference in San Diego, and there were about this number of people from all over the country, and I was so nervous I could barely stand up. And when I finished the program and was in this portion, a woman raised her hand and said, "Oh, I just thought this was a great program. I really love what you did with Thomas Jefferson, but I only have one question. How did you ever master what must have been his nervous tics and habits?" So, of course, the rest of the audience glared at her, but it was a good point. I just want to say a few words to try to maybe bring this all together slightly. I mean, clearly you've heard the difference between 19th century and 20th century faith in science, and that's really very interesting indeed. And I think if you had to pinpoint a moment where the center of gravity really shifted, it might be Einstein's letter to President Roosevelt saying, we have this device. We don't know if it works or not, but we think you ought to know about it. And there's a certain point at which in the 20th century we realize that science has a kind of momentum that is sometimes outside of the ethical political sphere. And there's a great book on the subject by Jacob Bronowski. I'm going to recommend about 6 books as we close, and if you don't want to write them down, but you do want to hear them, I'll give them to Tony Stewart. But this one is by Jacob Bronowski, and it's called Science and Human Values, and the first chapter is a wonderful chapter. He starts off, he was at Nagasaki just a few days after the explosion there, and he was with an Army team inspecting, and on the Jeep radio, as they were driving through this wreckage where all organic matter had simply been vaporized, and even inorganic matter had largely been vaporized, he heard on the radio a popular song from the post-war period, and the title was, "Is You Is or Is You Ain't My Baby?" And he made that the theme of his book. Is science is or is science not our baby? And if so, what are its implications? Well, for someone like Powell, science was virtually a religion. That's an Enlightenment view. I think we have a slightly more somber view in our own time. Another book that I recommend is by a man named Morris Berman called The Reenchantment of the World. And Berman's view is that the Cartesian split between mind and body and reason and passion has made us head delivery systems in the late 20th century. And by ignoring the organic and the integration between mind and body, we have despiritualized ourselves and our universe, and we have disenchanted it in a way that has very dangerous implications for the planet and for other species and for us. And unless we find some sensible way to re-enchant it, it looks bad. I think of Rachel Carson. My father-in-law is a farmer in Kansas. He died a couple of years ago. The incidence of cancer in the agricultural zones of Kansas is 4 times the national average. There is not a river in the state of Nebraska or Kansas that you would dare to drink a cup of water out of. It's probably true in Idaho. in around 1965, when DDT was first being regulated, my father-in-law spilled a gallon of it in a place in his backyard. And I moved into that little farmstead in 1989, and it's still bare. Where that DDT spilled has never grown anything in all of that time. And it's just part of the culture. Once he had me doing some spreading some herbicide on one of his cornfields, and the machine got jammed up. So he said, "Well, go ahead and get in it. Get in the tank and slosh around down there and see if you can open up the jets." And I was so son-in-law-like that I did it. But I'm in there sort of drinking death so that he can kill one more mite on his cornstalk. And this is happening in various ways at just every level of the society. And Rachel Carson told us, unmistakably, what had to be done. And the result has been a very mixed result indeed. I had a couch a couple of years ago that had grease marks on it, and so I called these couch people. And they came over, and they were great. They were wonderful, the sort of couch cleaning types. And the guy said, "I can clean this couch with this thing, or I can go get the real stuff." He said, when they banned this in 1980, we bought 200 gallons, and I've got some in the truck, so he brought it in, and the house just bleached, instantaneously. But it's banned now, but they had stored it up. And of course, we have pretty good environmental regulation in the United States, but all the same companies are still selling all the same stuff over our borders. So if you take any kind of a planetary view, it doesn't do you a lot of good to have an enlightened policy in Idaho if there isn't one also in British Columbia or Mexico or Costa Rica. The United States has been very slow to face that implication of globalism. As to Hubble, I don't know if you've seen the current issue of National Geographic, but it is one of the most amazing things I have ever seen in my life. Have you seen it? The Hubble has gotten a bad rap. You should see these pictures. This telescope, if you are not awakened to wonder by looking at the pictures that are being taken through this telescope, you are incapable of wonder. They pointed it at this tiny little speck of empty space at the end of the sky where there's nothing. They had never seen anything. And the photograph is of 75 or 80 beautiful spiral galaxies in an empty quarter. And then if you turn it on some of the hot zones in the universe, it's just an overwhelming mass. So I urge you to take a look at that. It really does reawaken you. And Thoreau, it seems to me that if you only could take one book with you to your desert island, it should be Walden. I read Walden 4 or 5 times a year now, and every time I read it, I'm swept away by Thoreau. Edward Abbey owes so much to Thoreau. The whole environmental movement owes almost everything to Thoreau. He was not a particularly nice fellow, but he certainly could write good prose. Well, and finally, Roosevelt. I'm from North Dakota. In North Dakota, we have no heroes. There are only 600,000 of us. You saw how pathetic we were when the Academy Awards came out and we sucked up to Fargo. But when the film was first made, all of Fargo was angry at the caricature. And then when the film began to be hot, they all tried to up their own language to make it sound a little bit more like those ditzoids. It was terrific. And now I guess Brainerd is mad in Minnesota because it was really Brainerd but called Fargo. They wanted the film called Brainerd. Anyway, since we have no history and no heroes, we sort of co-opt them. And Roosevelt was nice enough to spend a couple of years in the Badlands of western North Dakota. And then he was even nicer later. He said for one of the 300 or 400 times about different places in the world, if it hadn't been for my time in western North Dakota, I never would have been president of the United States, which we instantly named as our state's motto. So here's a guy who doesn't come from North Dakota, who's an aristocrat, an imperialist, and one of the great game killers of all time, who spent a short time in North Dakota, and we've made him our icon as the ideal North Dakotan. This is odd. But he did something, and this is an implication I want us all to think about as we talk about this issue this week. Roosevelt's greatness as a conservationist is one of the most anti-democratic moments in American history. And this has very interesting ethical implications, because Gifford Pinchot talked Roosevelt into setting aside by executive order 16 million acres of national forest in one moment, because Congress was about to close the gate on it. The president had that authority under a law, and the president and Gifford Pinchot sat in the White House and preserved 16 million acres of forest because he felt that it should be done. But it wouldn't have passed a national plebiscite. The Congress wasn't going to do it. The Congress was going to prevent it. So think about that. Now Bill Clinton has just done something similar in southern Utah, and he's being excoriated for it. But there is a very serious conflict, or at least tension, between democracy and wilderness. It's very interesting to think about, and troubling too, because the same people who like to think of democracy are the people who want anti-democracy to protect wilderness. So it's a quandary, I would say. And then finally, to the Manning question about, what's your house built from? There's a great book on this and other subjects which goes back to John Wesley Powell and connects with Thoreau. It's by John McPhee, called Encounters with the Archdruid. And it's 3 wonderful stories about the Colorado River Basin and the potential hypocrisy between the purism we wish we could live and the politics that we espouse. It's a great book. McPhee's books are always wonderful. And then finally, I'll just say this. Jefferson has taken a little bit of a beating tonight. He'll be here tomorrow all day, beginning at 10:30. I'm sure that he is a match for John Wesley Powell. But that reminded me of one last story. Powell was here in 1889 when this tier of states territories were becoming states, including North Dakota, Montana, and several others. I believe Idaho in 1889. John Wesley Powell made a loopy railroad journey through all of those states with his old nemesis, William Stewart. Stewart was the one who wanted just to open up the West to wholesale, unlimited development. And Powell was the one who wanted scientific restraints. And they gave point-counterpoint lectures to the constitutional conventions in all of the states that were being formed in that moment. I only know of 2 specifically, Montana and North Dakota. And Stewart said, hey, just go ahead and do it the way it's always been done. There's money to be made. But Powell said no. Learn from the mistakes of the past. And he proposed a whole range of enlightened suggestions for watershed counties and watershed districts and grazing districts and cooperative approaches to economic development and guarantees of equity. And then Stewart said, it's a lot more profitable just to open her up. And you know what happened. Every one of the states, in adopting its constitution, adopted the Jeffersonian, the Stewart model, and ignored John Wesley Powell. So that's Cassandra. Cassandra is the ancient Trojan priestess who always told the truth and was always ignored. And then after the truth came out, everyone went back to her and said, Cassandra, why didn't you tell us? Well, if that's not the history of resource policy in the United States, I don't know what is. So I really appreciated everything that I heard tonight, and I just love the generosity of spirit of these people who have so much else to do, but have taken their time to become extraordinary historical figures. Good night.
Thank you, thank you. I do think we have to be very grateful to Dr. Jenkinson, who really is the inspiration for this event that makes history come alive. Thank you to the panel, to the committee, Popcorn Committee, and to you as a wonderful audience. And I hope you will join Thomas Jefferson tomorrow at 10:30 in Schuler Auditorium. But remember, the music starts at 10:15. So good night to you all. Thank you very much.